Okay, so welcome class of 2024, and congratulations for choosing such a great program. I'm a graduate of the class of 2004, so 20 years before you. My name is Vasanthi Vanniasingham, and I'm going to sort of take you on a journey and weave into that journey what the Pulse and CDM has meant to me in my practice. I'm a practitioner here in town. Every journey starts with some sort of form of inspiration. I'm sure something inspired you to come to Dragon Rises. For me, often patients will ask you what made you become an acupuncturist. And I could actually say this is the syncretism of my whole life. But if I had to pick on something, I'd say that I read a book by an acupuncturist. And at the back of the book, she had little vignettes about her patients, how she saw them. And her name is Diane Connolly. And I really liked how she saw her patients because I'm an avid reader of biographies. And so at the end of the book, there was a little thing about the author, and it said that she was traveling in Singapore and she felt sick and she felt ill, and she was cured by an acupuncturist, and she decided to become an acupuncturist. And she lives in Maryland. And when I first came to this country, I lived in Maryland, and I had moved to Maryland from Singapore. So I had one of those aha moments like, oh, I could be her, she could be me, I can be an acupuncturist. So I'd say that's the spark that fueled the passion. And it's important to remember what fueled your passion to keep you going in tough times. So I suggest you think about that. Some people come to acupuncture school because they were healed by acupuncturists. Like I said, I think it's the syncretism of my whole life that led to that point. But I have a love for biographies, and the intake is really not unlike a biography. I love to see how a person transforms, or how they become who they're meant to be, or that sort of thing. So with that point in mind, so I'm going to make a number of points, so that's point number one, the inspiration. Remember what inspired you. And I will weave my story into it. So when I first came to Gainesville at the end of the last century, there were 3 acupuncture schools in Gainesville, and none of them exist today. And I went to the precursor of this school, and I wanted to apply, and I think the person who was looking at my transcripts wasn't familiar with foreign transcripts, and suggested, I have a PhD, but they suggested I go and do an AA degree, and because I didn't have any credits, and it's because in other countries there are different systems of education. So I thought, well, maybe this is not just meant for me, and I decided to experience acupuncture instead. So I started having acupuncture, partly because I was a little afraid of needles, and I didn't know if I could stick them into anybody. And while I was having acupuncture, my acupuncturist, Emily Black, she suggested that I apply to the other school that's now in Gainesville. It was in South Florida at that time, partly because they had a part-time program. And I applied, but I didn't go. And eventually somebody from that school called me and wanted to know why I wasn't coming to the school. And I explained that at that point in time, my life was sort of falling apart, and my marriage was falling apart, and I didn't want to leave Gainesville. And so he tried to persuade me that with energy medicine, things change. You change while you are studying this medicine. And that's something you should be aware of. It's inevitable in the system that you will transform yourself during this process. And he suggested I talk to somebody who taught at both schools, the school that was in Gainesville and the one that was in South Florida. And I called her up, and she called me back, and she listened to what I had to say. And she said something very important. She said, you bring to this medicine who you are. That's point number 2. You bring to this medicine who you are. And Dr. Hammer has mentioned this in his commentaries on COM. And when I heard those words, I knew I'd do the easier thing, stay in Gainesville. So I decided to apply to the school in Gainesville. And I told my acupuncturist that I decided to stay in Gainesville. And I was lying on a treatment table, and she said, oh, that's great news. The Hammers have just bought the school. And then she explained that Dr. Hammer was this eminent psychiatrist from New York, and that he had written the salient book on Oriental psychology, which I'm sure you all know, but I have it here. This is the third edition, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies. So she leaned over the table where I was lying and pulled that book out of the bookcase. And that's how that book came into my life. I didn't realize at the time that I would spend 10 years of my life co-teaching with Grant Stickley, Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies. But that brings me to the third point, which is mystery. There's always mystery in this medicine. And by mystery, I mean things that you can't explain. So when I first met Dr. Hammer, I realized by talking to him that the very week he decided to buy the school was the very week that that person asked me to talk to Pam Smith, that was her name, is her name, she's still here in Gainesville, who told me, who said, you bring to this medicine who you are. And the very week that I decided to come to the school. So I started school in 2001, about 1 or 2 weeks before 9/11. And I was in a very small class, a class of 3, soon to be 2. So I always had classes with other people, like the class above, eventually the class below. I had class not quite in the right order, like Meridians 101, followed by Meridians 205. But you know what? I never let it faze me. I just went with the flow. To me, the school was an oasis because of all the complications that were going on in my life at that point. So, I was under a lot of stress. I went through a divorce, I sold a house, I bought a house, moved, all the things that one should do all in 1 year. So, to me, it was an oasis. I didn't come to the school because of the pulse system. I knew nothing about it. In a way, I fell into it. So my very first class, on the very first day, was a pulse class. And in that class, there were my classmates, and there were also instructors, and there were a couple of students, senior students. One of them was Bethany Betchell. She's a practitioner here in town. And I knew her because our kids did kids yoga class together. And I knew she had a PhD in biophysics. And on that day, she said something. She'd taken some time off because she'd had a baby. And she said something quite extraordinary. She asked the instructor to remind her which pulse position had a quality in which you could tell that a person's ancestors had been persecuted. And I heard those words, I was astounded. So that was my introduction to the pulse. There was a pulse system in which you could tell something so profound, really got me. And I mentioned Bethany because I had a lot of respect for her. I think if I'd heard that from somebody else, I might not have noticed. But like me, she was a scientist. I was very left-brained at that time. And to hear those words from her perked my ears up. So that's quite a profound introduction to the pulse system. And by the end of that semester, I don't think I could ever look at a body of water, be it a spring or the ocean, without thinking of the pulse. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the pulse now. So that's point number 4 that I wish to make. The pulse is a dynamic map of the terrain of the person. And in Chinese medicine, we have 4 pillars of diagnosis. And pillars are very important because without the pillars, the house falls down. So you may have heard what those pillars of diagnosis is, but I'm going to go through them again. The first pillar is observation, seeing, literally. The second is listening. Sometimes smelling is included in that. The third is asking. And the fourth is palpation. And palpation can be channel palpation, it can be abdominal diagnosis, touching the abdomen, or ostensibly you would imagine pulse diagnosis is a form of palpation because you're touching the radial artery of the person. But in reality, the pulse is all 4 diagnostic systems. It's seeing, listening, asking, and touching. So you can see how profound the pulse is. It's seeing because there you have the map of the terrain. By looking at the pulse sheet, you can tell a lot of things about who that person is. It's like a secret map. I love maps, by the way. And this is a map of the body. I don't know if you can see it. Don't worry if you can't, it's outside your classroom in black and white. But that's a Tang Dynasty map of the human body where it looks like a landscape and there's even the Big Dipper in it. The pulse is a bit like that. It's a mysterious dynamic map. It can tell you a little bit about the history of the person. It can predict the future of the person. It's a present-day map of the person. So it's seeing because you can see what qualities describe the person. It's listening because you're listening to the heart rate, the rhythm. Is it regular? Is it irregular? Is it irregularly irregular? All that tells you something about the person. It's asking because you can ask questions. Depending on one of your findings, you can say the pulse suggests this, and then maybe the person opens up in some way. People love to have their pulses taken, usually, not everybody, okay? But usually if I have a difficult question to ask, I'm more likely to ask it while I'm on the pulse, because it's more comforting. It's also kind of a two-way system. And that goes on, that's really part of that touch. When I first met Dr. Hammer, of course, I asked him why he switched from psychiatry to acupuncture. And he said something was missing from psychiatry. And when I asked him what it was, he said touch. Touch was missing from psychiatry. So I can see why he was drawn to the pulse. And I'm sure you've all heard the story of how Dr. Hammer met Dr. Shen. And if you haven't, it's well written up in Hamilton Rhodes' herbal book that he's published. That is going to be one of your texts. In the preface of that, he brings in the story of how Dr. Hammer met Dr. Shen. It's worth looking up. And of course, it has to do with the pulse. Let me see what else I wanted to say about the pulse. So there you are, you're touching the radial artery of someone. Of course, all arteries are connected to the heart, but this is directly connected to the heart. And the pulse is also a holistic map because it's body, mind, and spirit. And it's, for me, it's a shen-to-shen communication, meaning that there are things you can know when you're on the pulse that maybe you wouldn't know otherwise. Dr. Hammer always used to say the pulse wants to inform. Pulse wants to inform. So for me, that shen-to-shen communication, and Shen spirit lives in the blood and resides in the heart, so it's, when your hands are on the pulse, that's something you can pick up on. And then I'm going to make a very personal statement about the pulse. The pulse was actually a portal to myself, in that it allowed me to trust my own intuition. I don't always trust it all the time, but mostly I do now, because there's a verifiable system there. It's a whole new language. So for me personally, this has been a very important thing. And I don't think you'll hear many people say that, because I haven't discussed it with anybody, and I just wanted to share how profound this is. At the end, if we have time, I'll tell you a few pulse stories. But I'm going to move on to the diagnostic system, the whole methodology. What I love about it is that when the patient comes, I give them forms to fill in, and I'm the kind of old-fashioned person. I don't send them the forms on the computer. I like them to fill them in my waiting room, and these days in my office, because I'm not using my waiting room because of COVID. But it's sort of fresh in their consciousness and their mind when they do it there and then. And of course, we've got the usual details and the medical history. And in my intake sheets, there's a very elaborate birth history. And that's part of what I learned from Dr. Hammer, incorporating the birth history. And I've had many patients actually cry in my waiting room, filling in that part of the form. And people saying things like, nobody's ever asked me these questions. And really, the first, our early years are formative years. And in Chinese medicine, we say life unfolds in cycles of 7 and 8. And really, within the first 7 or 8 years, you've already got all the survival mechanisms have set in. And these survival mechanisms allow us to experience life and add to our qi. We are all expressions of qi. And when we have experiences, we add to our qi. No human baby can survive on its own. It has to have a caregiver, and therein lies the faulty mechanisms of having to, formulate survival mechanisms. And these survival mechanisms are good, but eventually they might become misbehaviors. We form them because we want to stay in contact with people, to stay basically intact. This is all jargon from Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies. And as long as they serve us, they're good. But eventually when we are adults, or when we have the awareness to transcend those survival mechanisms, the survival mechanisms hold a lot of energy, and that energy can go towards healing. Energy is always freely available. You don't have to provide all your own energy, but it traps things in the body. Let's just put it that way. So for me, the birth history part of the intake is very important. Once the patient has filled in the forms, then I start with the unelaborated. I follow the format of the sheet, which is list your complaints, but don't elaborate on them. So they'll list all the complaints, and then I'll start going through them one by one. And if a person is elderly or something like that, they don't really want to fill in their birth history, or they don't remember anything, it doesn't really matter. I have enough experience to read through the information and get what I need from the intake. And usually, you will learn a very rigorous methodology on how to carry out the intake and interpret it. And it's worth learning. Eventually, you will be able to shorten it in your own practice. It's a very wonderful methodology because it keeps you open to all possibilities. And that's something else I learned from Dr. Hammer, because sometimes people would tell me things. So Dr. Hammer, after I graduated, we still met. He mentored me for many years. I took his pulse intensives for over 10 years after I graduated. In the beginning, I was wondering why he asked me to come back for these pulse intensives. I thought I'd already learned everything. But really, when you leave school, you've just got a basic knowledge of things, and the real learning starts afterwards. So while you're in school, it's worth focusing on the material in the school is offering you. It's quite substantial. So what I was going to say is that he continued to mentor me after I left school. Like, he would meet with me every 2 weeks or so. And I've forgotten what I wanted to say about that. Staying open. So sometimes my patients would say things which are beyond my realm of comfort, more in the psychological or spiritual or other dimensions. And he just said to me, stay open, just listen. Stay open, just listen. And those words have been very important to me. More about the calm intake. So the intake takes a period of time. And that period of time is very important for me as a practitioner, partly because it sets up the patient-practitioner relationship, which is another great book that Dr. Hammer wrote. And the patient-practitioner relationship is a field of resonance. Ganying is the Chinese word for it. You're setting up a field of resonance between you and your patient. And when a person walks into my office, they may say some off thing, or I may not, be open to them. But by the end of the intake, I've dropped my prejudices. I've found the beauty of who that person is. Western medicine is always looking at what's wrong with you, and Chinese medicine allows you to see the whole person. And we all have something wrong with us. That's why they came, right? Whether they've got chi stagnation or blood deficiency or whatever. But the intake allows you to see the beauty of who that person is. It helps me open my heart, drop my biases, open my heart and find compassion for that person. So that's what I mean by setting up the field of resonance. And that field of resonance, for me, is based on the concept of mutual nourishment. This is something I learned directly from Dr. Hammer. In one of those mentoring sessions, he said something about all relationships should be mutually nourishing. And when I was in his office, I thought, I better drop all those relationships which aren't nourishing me. And by the time I walked to my car and sat down and reflected on that statement, I realized that no, if I assume that all relationships are mutually nourishing, I mean all, it shifts my awareness and perception. I hope you get it. So that's how I look at my patient. I look at it as if they are also going to nourish me. So it's a two-way street. And when you have a two-way street, you're never drained. And it's sort of inferred in the paragraph that from Dragon Rise Red Butterflies that's often quoted in the graduation program. And I'm sure you've heard it, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but I'm just going to read it out to you. This is something Dr. Hammer says. He says, "May the medicine be for you as it is for me, the fulfillment of a search for a congenial system of healing that embodies the inseparability of body, mind, spirit, matter, nature, and man, philosophy and reality. A personal, subtle, gentle, yet highly technical medical system which allows you to be close to essence, to the life force, both your own and that of others. The reasons for using it, teaching it, discussing it are twofold. First, it works. Second, it is a masterpiece of harmony, intricacy, and movement, which never ceases to engage, fascinate, and intrigue. It surrounds us like nature or a great work of art. We are consumed and renewed at the same time." That sort of summarizes that relationship and the whole process. For me, when I graduated from Dragon Rises, I audited the dance and medicine class at the University of Florida, and I had to write a creative process paper. And in writing that paper, I realized that this is my art, and that's how I practice it. I practice it as if it's my creative art. And it is creative because it's based on patterns. It's a science of patterns, but how you put it together and how you carry it out can be your art. So to reiterate, I started off by talking about inspiration. There's mystery. Mystery is alluded to even in Dragon Rise. He quotes the Tao Te Ching, the first chapter, which ends mystery upon mystery. And by that I mean the ineffable. The third point I was trying to make was that you bring to this medicine who you are. The fourth was about the pulse being a wonderful diagnostic system. And we've talked a little bit about the common intake and what it means to me and how I practice. And the last point I want to make is awareness. This is a much bandied word in the school, I'm sure, but I never heard it, that acupuncture engenders awareness, until Dr. Hammer's teaching the precursor of that CDM course to my class, and he said that, and my ears perked up, and I thought, oh, all my life I've been interested in consciousness and metaphysics, and I hadn't thought of that this could be a part of Chinese medicine, which obviously I'm sure you're all heard of it. And I want to say that so there's talk that the consciousness of the awareness of the physician is also very important, but the real statement should really be that acupuncture engenders awareness to the patient and to the practitioner. As you practice acupuncture, you become more and more aware. And none of this I can prove, but that it just is that way. Because there's really no separation between you and the patient in a kind of philosophical way. Well, we still have a few minutes. I don't know how long I'm supposed to be talking till, but I'm going to maybe talk about, give you 3 little pulse stories and maybe a common intake story. So one time, I taught in the school for 12 years and supervised for 12 years. And one time I was in the clinic supervising, and there was a patient who came in, and I was taking his pulse, checking the pulse, and I hadn't seen him for a while, and he had a new student practitioner. And on his pulse, I felt a quality that indicated maybe he was thinking a little bit about death. I'm sorry, my cats are about to have a cat fight. If you hear any noise, that's the cats. Every morning they have a little skirmish. And so I didn't want to ask him because I wondered for a moment whether it was his wife who had passed away. But the student was in there and there was an observer. They were talking to the patient while I was taking the pulse. And I realized that it was his dog that died. Now, what mystified me about this quality is that normally it's a quality that you'd find in the left middle position. But on that day, I felt it in the proximal position. So I asked him, what did the dog die of? And he said, oh, kidney failure. And then I realized why I felt it on the proximal position, because that is a kidney pulse. And like I said, the pulse wants to inform. And as soon as he said that, the quality disappeared. Now, I'm not going to elaborate whether that factored into the treatment plan, because I can't remember. But I just want to say that the pulse does want to inform. So that's the point I'm trying to make. The second case I'm going to talk about is one of my own patients, and I'm trying to be very wary of HIPAA. So this was an elderly gentleman. He came in for some minor kind of pain, toe pain, knee pain, something like that. But I was taking a full pulse. And when I was on his neuropsych position, there was a quality there that made me ask the question if he'd had some head trauma. And he said, oh, yes. When I was growing up, I lived in a country that was very violent. And the neighbors were always shooting at each other. And at some point one day, when there was a lull in the shooting, I crept through the drawing room because I was hungry. I was going to go to the kitchen. But a bullet came in through the window and grazed the back of my head. And of course, my parents took me to the doctor. They patched me up. It was just a graze, nothing. They stopped the bleeding, whatever. Years later, he was doing a study at the university where it was a cognitive study. And they were also running MRIs in relation to that study. And they informed him that he had a bullet under his skull. And so, even though this has nothing to do with whatever I was doing, but he was very excited. He brought in the MRI. I mean, in a way, this helped the patient maybe trust the system. Maybe not. I never asked him, like I said, but it made me trust the system more, that I could pick up something, which through asking led to a whole other thing. That's story number 2. Story number 3 is a story about my father. When he was 91, he fell and broke his hip, and he had to have surgery. And he had to wait a few days because he was on blood thinners. They have to get you off blood thinners. And there was nothing I could do, so I was, taking his pulse daily. I was doing a few needles, but I was taking his pulse a couple of times a day and bouncing it out, so to speak. After the surgery, he was in this special room where, I don't know what you call it, it's not a recovery room or something like that. And only one person at a time was allowed in, and my sister dashed in to see him. But the doctor felt sorry for me, and he said, oh, you can go in too. So we were on either side of his bed. She'd been there for a while, and she was talking to him. And when I came in, he started talking to me. And my sister's very observant. She's an architect. And she said, oh, how come he can hear you and he can't hear me? Because she had been shouting at him, and because he wasn't wearing his hearing aids. Neither did he have his glasses, having just come out of surgery. But I knew that he could converse with me because we had been so in touch through the pulse that there was a sort of a liminal space where he could hear me even though he couldn't hear me. I didn't bother to explain it to her, but that's something I want to allude to. You can leave it in the realm of mystery, but the pulse enables this. And again, I can't prove it. So those are my 3 pulse stories. And I think we've got time for one story about the intake. Early in my practice, I had an office out in the countryside, and I would go there a couple of times a week. And a woman came to see me. She was on a boat, and she'd fallen. I don't know, fallen in the boat or out of the boat or whatever, but the net effect of that was that she couldn't move her arm, she couldn't move her shoulder. And when she came to see me, I knew it was going to be a one-time treatment because I wasn't going to be there later that week and she was leaving. And I wondered whether I should do a full intake or if I should take a shortcut and just treat the pain. And I decided to do a full intake, as I was trained. And I'm telling the story for a reason, because sometimes when people come into the clinic, you might be, oh, why are we doing this full intake when they've got a broken finger or something, okay? So anyway, I did this full intake. She was a very shy, reticent person, maybe in her 50s. She'd taken early retirement. As I was doing the intake, she was kind of slightly bemused and at my questions. Eventually I asked the one question I was dying to ask her was, what was she doing on that boat? And her eyes lit up and sparkled, and she said it was her life's dream to be on a boat and to sail around Florida and the islands. And, she was the kind of person who had maybe a secretarial job or a job in an office. And she said finally, she took early retirement maybe. I'm maybe exaggerating the story, but something like this. And she had met a partner who was willing to join her in this endeavor and make it happen. And she was so full of joy, all right, that this was the highlight of her whole life. And too bad she had this fall. All right, then I started treating her. I did everything I knew to do, mirrored, imaged, you name it. I did it. I couldn't see a bit of change. And her arm was still stuck in that position. And she was waiting in the waiting room for the partner to pick her up. And I had a colleague at the time who was an acupuncturist, but a nurse. And I had her look at the arm, and she said the same thing I said. If it's not better, you must go to the emergency room or see a doctor, go to the urgent care clinic, something like that, because it could be a dislocated shoulder. That was the end of that. She left. And 2 days later, the reason I couldn't come twice that week was because I was in Orlando at a workshop, and I got a call from her, and she said she was leaving on Saturday, and she wanted to have a follow-up treatment the next day, and I explained I wasn't going to be there. And then I asked her how she was, and she said she was totally fine, that she had full range of motion and no pain. She just thought it'd be nice to see me again. And you could have knocked me down with a feather. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I am pretty sure that it was nothing to do with the needles, that it was really everything to do with the intake. And Dr. Ham always says, and it's part of the premise of Dragon Rises, Red Bird Flies, is that everybody wants to be seen and heard. Everybody wants to be seen and heard. This is a very healing thing. We are all healers, whether we're practicing healing or not, we are all healers. And one of my mentors, Jeffrey Yuan, used to say that maybe healers are healers because they need more healing than the other people. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I hope you got something out of it. If anybody has any questions, I might be able to answer them. I think we're about on time. It's probably time for your break.
I'm coming.
Any questions? Anything want to say anything? Shannon, want to say anything?
Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, we have like 3 laptops up here.
All right, well.
Thank you so much for coming. Does anybody have any questions before we sign off? No. Thank you so much for coming. This was lovely. It was so good to